Sometimes the world just has weird things in store for us. Maybe you're working on a movie and find out you've just filmed a scene with a real human skeleton. Maybe the people connected to the film just start dying. Maybe the director is responsible for the deaths of 2 children, and maybe, just maybe, you get into a car accident and your assistant is decapitated in a similar manner to a scene you created. All this and more will be covered on our first 2-part series. This is Talk Hollywood to Me. Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to Talk Hollywood to Me, where I talk Hollywood to you. My name is Sierra and I hope you all had a great summer, whether or not you worked, traveled, studied abroad, or did absolutely nothing but listen to scary stories, podcasts, and play video games like I did. I finished Dragon Age Inquisition 5 different times in the span of about 2 weeks, and I've yet to understand why anyone loves Solus because he looks like an egg. That's just my 2 cents anyway. I also went to a family reunion in upstate New York, where I'm from, in Potsdam, which is almost 4 hours away from Rochester and far away from civilization. Well, it's about an hour's drive to Canada from Potsdam, so it's not too far away. I did get to see my mom's cousin Jeff eat a semi-frozen pudding shot off the asphalt, so it's good to know where you come from. Anyway, my Rochester, Buffalo, and Syracuse fam, make some noise. I'd snap my fingers, but I don't know how to do that or ride a bike, so you'll just have to pretend. If you're from Copperas Cove or Fort Hood, Texas, Louisville, Kentucky, or Huntersville, North Carolina, feel free to make some noise too. Being in a military family was fun, assigned Army Brat at Murray. That aside, I know it's a bit early to talk about spooky things, but if I time this right, this will air soon after Friday the 13th. That movie series isn't too great, but in the 9th one, Jason goes to hell and in Jason X, he's in space, so you can't say they don't lack creativity. But that series isn't what I'm talking about today, as well as in the next episode. I'll be discussing 5 movie sets that are supposedly cursed and or haunted. All of these took place from the 1960s to the 1980s, and I, for one, am very disappointed we don't get as much of that now. Granted, the 80s were a different time, one where you could buy a real human skeleton and also not be charged for 3 different people's deaths. I hope I have your attention now if I didn't already. In this particular episode, depending on how much I'm able to cover within an hour, I'll be covering 2 or 3 of the 5 mentioned, which, means a 2-parter. Look, I'm a real podcaster now. But I started writing this episode back before Hurricane Part 2, so let me also say welcome back from Hurricane Break 2. I already joked about this to my friends, but imagine that Dorian was just a you thought hurricane, and next will be out the entirety of October. That'd be fun, wouldn't it? I sincerely hope that all of you and your loved ones and pets stayed safe no matter where you were during the past week, and all your valuables were safe and stayed safe. Hopefully you were the only person you had to worry about, because my mom lives 2 hours north of Wilmington and my grandfather lives a little north of Daytona Beach in Florida, so I had a very fun time worrying about them. They're both safe, by the way, no damage whatsoever, and I am incredibly grateful. Anyway, moving on to our first movie. This 1968 psychological and supernatural horror film is regarded as a horror classic, but knowing Roman Polanski did some rather unsavory and very illegal things too, and involving minors, the rape scene with the devil ends up accidentally becoming the scariest thing in the movie. We love a director that's a convicted rapist but still wins awards in the present day. First up is Rosemary's Baby, starring Mia Farrow, John Cassavetes, Ruth Gordon, Maurice Evans, and Ralph Bellamy, just to name a few. For those that don't do horror or just haven't seen it, Rosemary's Baby is about a young couple that move into a New York City apartment building even after their friend tries to talk them out of it because the apartment building in question has some associations with cannibalism and murder. Long story short, their neighbors are Guy, played by John Cassavetes, and the husband of the titular Rosemary are Satanists and give birth to the Antichrist. Fun movie, isn't it? Here's an unrelated bit of trivia about the movie, or rather Mia Farrow. To sum up what I had initially written, which was a bit long, she was once married to Frank Sinatra, but the marriage fell apart due to her becoming bored after once agreeing to give up acting for him and signed on Rosemary's Baby. Filming went over at Sinatra's miff. He had the divorce papers served to her on set. Despite the failure of the marriage, which Mia Farrow attributes to the age gap, she was 21 when they wed and he was 50, and that she was a quote-unquote impossibly immature teenager, they remained friends until Sinatra's death in 1998. Such good friends were they that once news broke about Woody Allen sexually assaulting Farrow's adopted daughter, Dylan, and Allen shacking up with Farrow's other adopted daughter, Suni Previn, at some point when they were still dating, that Sinatra offered to have Allen taken out, aka murdered. For those unaware, Sinatra had some ties to the mob and had for decades, which is more or less an open secret back in the days of old Hollywood. No one said anything about it, but they all knew more or less. Farrow declined, but Sinatra contacted his mob friend and asked if anything could be done. Unfortunately, his friend was too low on the ladder to get anything done, but you can't fault him for trying. But can you imagine, though? Imagine that your friend, Frank Sinatra, asks you if you can have someone kill Woody Allen for him. Imagine if Woody Allen actually did get taken out by the mob. God, that would have been great. Iconic even. Love that. But now in 2019, we know that if a movie has some connection to the demonic, some not great things might start happening. The most obvious one being that Roman Polanski's then-wife Sharon Tate was brutally murdered by the Manson family along with 4 others on the property in August 1969. According to a Vanity Fair article titled The Most Cursed Hit Movie Ever Made, Tate loitered around the Rosemary's Baby set after losing out on the lead role to Mia Farrow and supposedly took an increasing interest in the occult. Years later, a friend of Tate's had quoted her as saying, "The devil is beautiful. Most people think he's ugly, but he's not." Polanski saw his wife for the last time in July 1969. In his autobiography, he had what he calls a grotesque thought, which was that he would never see her again. Sometimes you just know. After the murders, people jumped to the idea and conclusion that Satanism and devil worship played a hand in the murders. In 1969, no one ever thought a crime like that could be possible. This was still the time period where you could leave your doors unlocked and not worry about any intruders coming in. Things like the Tate murders were just absolutely unheard of. It wasn't until the 1970s, 1980s, where it was becoming more obvious and apparent that crimes like that could be possible, that human beings could actually do that to each other. Cue the satanic panic period of time slowly building up. Some people wanted to hold the Beatles responsible because their song title Helter Skelter was spelled, or rather misspelled, at the crime scene in blood. But yeah, people just be like that sometimes, you know. Now let's jump into some of the less well-known things. First, I'll say this, a composer of the film is Polish, and I cannot pronounce his first name, and probably will not correctly. So for everyone's sake, and to respect the dead, I will not try lest I butcher it, so I'll refer to him by his last name, Komeda, which I hope I am at least pronouncing correctly. Komeda, it's said, was the first unlucky person in the supposed curse. In the fall of 1968, the then 37-year-old composer was at a party and participated in a bit of roughhousing. During this, he fell off a rocky slope and slipped into a 4-month coma in which he never regained consciousness and died in his native homeland of Poland the following year. In the book on which the film is based, the witches did the same thing in order to kill a friend of Rosemary's. In 1969, producer William Castle was out of his mind with worry due to the hate mail that he was constantly receiving, as the film was not really popular with the Catholic crowd, obviously, and received a C grade from presumably the Catholic Legion of Decency, an organization that was formed in about 1933 that wanted to fight against things considered quote-unquote morally objectionable in film by the American Catholic Church, with the C grade meaning condemned, which the film was given for making a mockery of religious people and practices. Out of the blue, Castle developed severe kidney stones and was rather off his gourd with delirium in the hospital. He would hallucinate scenes from the film and had even yelled, "Rosemary, for God's sake, drop the knife." Though he barely recovered, he did make it through the kidney stones and survived, but he never made a hit in Hollywood again. Ira Levin, author of the original novel, didn't escape the cursed fate either. His marriage fell apart with the divorce being finalized in 1968, and though Levin was rather private regarding his personal life and personal matters, he also did write The Stepford Wives, which, if you know anything about the original and not the comedic remake from 2004, might just say it all. Levin never, as Vanity Fair puts it, quote, rode the Rosemary's Baby wave in Hollywood, but did most certainly get the fame he sought. The author is also a Jewish atheist and said in a 2002 interview that he doesn't believe in Satan, and has also stated that he doesn't believe in witches or curses, but even so, as he wrote the novel, his reservations grew. He was afraid of backlash because the book could be considered blasphemous and feared any kind of blacklisting or anything much worse. In a 1980 interview on The Dick Cavett Show alongside Stephen King, of all people, Levitt said that of his childhood horror inspirations, "I don't recall being scared at all. Now I'm terrified." In a 1992 interview, he confessed to having mixed feelings about Rosemary's Baby in regards to how his novel played a significant part in all this popularization of the occult and belief in witchcraft and Satanism. Levin also added, quote, "I really feel a certain degree of guilt about having fostered that kind of irrationality." As the years went by and there were more spin-off sequels and copycats of his works, he became rather disenchanted with it. He did less and less interviews, wrote to less and less critical acclaim, and stopped mingling amongst the New York literary circles he once longed to be a part of. When the 30th anniversary of Rosemary's Baby was around the corner, he wrote a sequel to the novel titled Son of Rosemary. Though it was panned, it became a bestseller and survived on those royalties until his death a decade later in 2007. The last thing, though, in regards to the apartment complex the young Rosemary and Guy Woodhouse moved into, the Bramford. For exterior shots, the co-op apartment complex, the Dakota, was used. While many famous tenants resided there, perhaps the most notable is John Lennon, who was murdered outside the front of the apartment in 1980 by Mark David Chapman. How's that for another Beatles connection? So now let's jump 5 years forward to the release of another horror classic that I actually wrote a paper on last semester, 1973's The Exorcist. The 1973 supernatural horror film starred Ellen Burstyn, Max von Sydow, Jason Miller, Linda Blair, and Lee J. Cobb. A fun fact about this movie is that I cried while watching it. Not out of fear, no, but because 13-year-old me loved the character of Father Karras, so when he sacrificed himself at the end of the movie, I was in tears. Especially when his friend Father Dyer was giving him last rites at the bottom of the staircase as he's bleeding out. Ugh. I read the book, I cried again. I still don't know why this happened, but granted, I am also the person who at age 6 had an emotional breakdown after learning Jerry Orbach died. Listen, I watched a lot of OG Law & Order growing up, and I love the character of Lenny Briscoe with his one-liners in front of murder scenes. It would also be a few years before I learned he played the dad in Dirty Dancing, was also the voice of the Lumiere in the animated Beauty and the Beast movie. I just had a lot going on both times in my life, okay? Anyway, it's a little hard to find any serious articles about The Exorcist set supposedly being cursed and or haunted, unless you want to count Ranker for some reason. One thing I can tell you about the movie from the paper that I wrote for my film class was that at many theaters across the country, people had paramedics calling because people were being sent into hysterics by the movie. People were fainting, passing out, vomiting, basically anything you can imagine. Most notably, the scene people had a lot of offense towards was the scene where they walk in and Reagan is masturbating with the crucifix and there's the blood anywhere and just everything she's saying. That was what people had a lot of objection to, considering Linda Blair was very young at the time, like 12 to 14 years old, if I remember right. And obviously that was very upsetting to a great many people. And there were a few injuries on the set to get this started. In the scene where Reagan slaps her mother and Ellen Burstyn is sent across the room, her scream of pain is genuine. She fell on her coccyx after the harness she was wearing jerked her hard enough over and suffered a permanent spinal injury. Linda Blair also injured her back during the scene where she's thrown about on the bed after a piece of the rig broke. Anyone that watches that scene can probably imagine how that back pain must have been, considering if I sleep on my back wrong, my back hurts for the rest of the day. The set for the McNeil house also burned down and delayed filming for about 6 weeks. The cause? A bird flying into a circuit box. But only one room remained untouched. Reagan's bedroom. You know, the room where they did all of the exorcism scenes? Yeah. Actor Jack McGowan, who played director Burke Dennings in the film, died shortly after completing his scenes in the movie, which ended with his character dying as well. McGowan didn't have a wild death like Dennings, instead dying from complications of influenza during a London flu epidemic. The actress that played Damien Karras' mother also died shortly after filming. Both died before the film's release. It's also said that Linda Blair and Max von Sydow lost family members during the shoot, and Jason Miller's son almost died in a motorcycle accident. It's also said that during the film's Rome premiere, lightning struck the 400-year-old cross that sat atop a nearby 16th century church. With everything that happened on set, it's no surprise that they had a priest called in to talk with the cast and crew and reassure them, stopping just short of blessing the set. And with all that aside, did you know the story of The Exorcist was based on a real exorcism? Yep, author of the original 1971 novel, William Peter Blatty, had heard about the case from a 14-year-old boy only identified by the pseudonyms of Roland Doe or Robbie Mannheim, and found himself rather interested in the case in the notes written by attending priest Raymond J. Bishop. After his family noticed objects moving on their own and levitating when their son was nearby, as well as their son becoming notably aggressive and acting out, they called upon local Catholic priests for help, which resulted in numerous exorcisms being performed on the boy. In recent times, it's speculated that the boy might not even have been possessed in the first place, and instead suffered some kind of mental illness and maybe his own teen angst, which would explain words being carved into his skin, amongst other things. Of course, there are reports of many Jesuit priests and witnesses seeing for themselves words appearing on his skin, objects such as the bed moving, a demonic voice coming from the boy, basically everything you can imagine a standard possessed child story. Bloody also took inspiration from the 17th century French cases of the Louviers and Laudon possessions, both of which involved priests and nuns being demonically possessed. The latter inspired a few books and plays as well as a movie, 1971's The Devils, directed by Ken Russell and starring Oliver Reed and Vanessa Redgrave. That movie, if I may be blunt, is off the shits. It is totally insane. It got an X rating for the vulgarity of it all. And it was banned in several countries, and it got an X rating due to disturbingly violent sexual and religious content. Got the X rating in both the UK and the US, and it's never received a release in its original uncut form in various countries. You can find it if you look around the internet hard enough if you really want to, but it is something, I will say that much. With the Laudon possessions, a priest named Urbain Grandier was said to be influencing nuns and having them become involved with Satan and bewitching them, when really he was most likely just a very horny priest who kept sleeping with these nuns. Anyway, he ended up being burnt at the stake or something like that, so there's that. But really, lots of supposed possessions and bewitches, like in the Salem witch trials, can be attributed to some kinds of mental illness or epileptic seizures, the latter of which features contortions of the body, sometimes foaming at the mouth, a lot of jerking motions, etc. In the times where there was pretty much nothing known about any kinds of mental illness, especially epilepsy being a neurological condition, it could have been very easily mistaken for demonic possession. A lot of modern analyses of past exorcisms suggest that maybe the people involved had some kind of seizure or seizures, which would explain a lot. Not so much speaking in tongues, though, although sometimes can be taught to speak in tongues. See, Robert De Niro at the end of the 1991 remake of Cape Fear, he speaks in tongues at the end, and it's pretty freaky, in my opinion. And while The Exorcist might not be as freaky and weird as Rosemary's Baby, the audience reaction sure was something, including Linda Blair receiving death threats and hate mail because people actually believed she was possessed and had to have bodyguards for the next 6 months after the film's release. I can tell you, though, that the next cases I'll be covering in the next episode are far crazier. And while the very last one I plan to cover doesn't necessarily involve a curse set, it does have an incredible tragedy, one that hasn't resulted in the director being charged with what could possibly count as negligent homicide. I won't give away names for that one, but I hope you guys have strong stomachs. Now, I'll tell you what the next two are, which might seem a little obvious if you know your horror stuff and do a little bit of digging. The next movie we will be covering is 1976's The Omen, starring Gregory Peck, which also about a little boy being the Antichrist. The other movie I'll be covering is another fun one, which we'll know as Poltergeist. That one has a few interesting things going on with it, considering that, well, here's a fun fact I'll give you to look forward to that one. Apparently at the time, in the early 80s, it was much cheaper to buy real human skeletons than plastic ones. So I want you to imagine being the actress that played the mom in the pool scene. She swung around and the skeleton pops up. And imagine finishing that scene and then learning, oh, by the way, that was a real human skeleton. That person was alive once. And just having to deal with that information for the rest of your life. One of the movies that in retrospect should have been rated PG-13, along with Gremlins, but the PG-13 rating didn't exist until Red Dawn came out in 1984, so there's a fun little bit of extra trivia for you. Now, with that information, I really hope you don't go, jumping ahead of me and reading about those two movies yourself, but I hope you wait on me for that one. And in any case, it's going to be a good time learning about that, people dying, weird coincidences, real human skeletons, And then in the last episode, a famous director who's still really well known today and who has movie posters. This director still has posters of his movie that line walls of every college student's dorm room, myself included, which, oops. So every time I look at it, I am reminded that the director is responsible for the deaths of 3 people, 2 of which were children. So I hope you guys really do have strong stomachs learning about that last one, because it's not pretty. And that is the end of the first episode return of this podcast, and I finally figured out a sign off I can say at the end of every episode that is also a movie reference and a reference to Army of Darkness, and I'm doing this because I like to be unique and original and not like every other podcast on the planet, so don't at me. If you guys enjoyed this, be sure to let myself know as well as those at Hawkstream Radio. You can find my podcast and many more on iTunes, Spotify, and on the Hawkstream Radio website itself, which you can visit at uncw.tealtv.org/Hawkstream. Be sure to tune into the next episode where hopefully I can finish up these fun little scary stories, but if not, we're going for a part 3. Well, the last story can be its own thing, I suppose, so let's make that its own episode as there is a lot of criminal negligence to cover. But for now, this is Sierra from Talk Hollywood to Me, where I talk Hollywood to you. Hail to the king, baby.